That Christmas Eve, I sat directly beneath the grandest tree in a house the entire town considered a holiday monument, yet I remained the only person whose name went uncalled. My father handed wrapped boxes to my mother, my sister, her fiancé, and our estate manager. He looked right through me, treating me like an empty chair. They did not realize that if I vanished from their perfect family portrait, their entire winter empire would collapse with me. I am Ava Ravenswood. At 34 years old, I had mastered the art of being entirely invisible in a room designed specifically to be looked at. The room in question was the grand parlor of Wintermere House, our family's sprawling, oceanfront estate in Newport, Rhode Island. The salt-heavy wind of the Atlantic Ocean battered against the floor-to-ceiling leaded windows, but inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly warm. The air was thick with the scent of fresh pine needles, the rich aroma of roasted meats from the kitchen, and the cloying, heavy perfume of old money. We had just returned from the annual Wintermere Charity Gala, an exhausting, glittering affair where the Ravenswood name was paraded before the town like royalty. Now, it was time for the private family dinner, the supposedly intimate gathering that took place beneath a towering spruce decorated meticulously in silver and ice blue glass. I sat on the edge of a velvet settee, nursing a crystal glass of sparkling water. I wore a tailored, midnight blue silk dress. It was elegant, muted, and perfectly modest, designed specifically not to draw the eye. I was the structural beam hidden behind the decorative drywall of this family, unglamorous, but bearing all the weight. By stark contrast, my younger sister, Ivy, lounged on the chaise across from me like a reigning monarch. She was the pristine, highly filtered face of the Wintermere brand on every social media platform. Clad in a scarlet gown that commanded absolute attention, her laughter chimed loudly, a perfectly practiced sound meant for an invisible audience. My father, Malcolm Ravenswood, stood by the roaring hearth. He wore his bespoke tuxedo like a suit of armor, radiating the unearned confidence of a man who believed the world owed him its unwavering reverence. It was the hour of the gift exchange, a carefully choreographed ceremony he presided over with the grandeur of a king dispensing favors to his loyal subjects. I watched in silence as he approached my mother, Celeste. He handed her a flat, velvet-covered box. When she snapped it open, the firelight caught the brilliance of a vintage diamond and sapphire collar necklace. She gasped perfectly, lifting the cold stones to her throat. Next, Malcolm turned to Ivy, presenting her with a heavy, polished wooden case. Inside rested a rare, limited-edition timepiece, the kind of watch that cost more than a modest home. Ivy squealed, wrapping her arms around his neck in a display of exaggerated affection. Then came Declan Shaw, Ivy's impeccably groomed fiancé. Malcolm clapped the young man on the shoulder and handed him a small, leather-bound box. Declan opened it to reveal the gleaming keys to a European sports car. Even our longtime housekeeper, standing rigidly by the archway to the dining room, received a thick envelope of cash, handed over with a patronizing nod of gratitude from my father. I remained seated, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I watched the pile of gifts beneath the tree dwindle to nothing. My breathing was slow and measured. Initially, my logical mind attempted to construct a rational explanation for what was happening. I assumed my gift was simply misplaced. Perhaps it had been pushed too far behind the embroidered tree skirt, or maybe it had been left on the mahogany desk in his study. I maintained my composure, my spine perfectly straight, utilizing the stoicism I had developed over decades of saving my own face when no one else would bother to do it for me. I was used to waiting, used to being the afterthought, but I still expected the bare minimum of parental acknowledgement. But there was no misplaced box. Malcolm stepped back from the tree, dusted his hands lightly together, and picked up his flute of vintage champagne. He looked around the room, letting his gaze sweep over his wife, his golden child daughter, his future son-in-law, and the lavish spread waiting on the dining table in the adjoining room. His eyes passed over me as smoothly as if I were merely a shadow cast by the furniture. "Well," Malcolm announced, his voice booming with forced holiday cheer, Let us not let the roast grow cold. To family. He raised his glass. The others eagerly followed suit. I did not touch my glass. The silence in my corner of the room seemed to stretch, pulling tighter and tighter like a violin string about to snap. I finally spoke up, my voice remarkably soft, completely devoid of any tremble or accusation. Was there perhaps an oversight? I asked. The festive atmosphere shattered instantly. It was not a loud disruption, but rather the sudden, chilling sensation of all the air being sucked from the room. Celeste slowly lowered her champagne flute. She turned her head to look at me, and the expression on her impeccably preserved face was one of raw, unfiltered disgust. It was the look one might give a servant who had dropped a tray of expensive china during a crucial dinner party. "You are only useful when things are about to collapse," my mother said, her tone cold enough to freeze the wine in her glass. "Tonight, there is no crisis." I absorbed the words. They did not pierce my skin. Rather, they settled like heavy stones in my chest, confirming a truth I had spent my entire adult life trying to ignore. Ivy let out a sharp, melodic laugh that cut through the lingering tension. She adjusted her new watch, admiring her reflection in its polished face. "You were invited out of politeness," she said, driving another social blade into my ribs. "Not because you belong in this picture." I shifted my gaze to my father. I waited for him to speak. I waited for the patriarch, the man whose legacy I had secretly propped up on my own shoulders, to reprimand his wife and younger daughter. I waited for him to correct the record, to offer a clumsy apology, to even look me in the eye. Malcolm did nothing. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his champagne. He did not scold anyone. He did not amend their cruel statements. He completely refused to look at me. In that suffocating room, his silence was the loudest sound of all. It was an endorsement. It was a calculated erasure. That deafening silence made the humiliation infinitely sharper than any screamed insult or thrown glass. I did not react the way they wanted. I did not scream, nor did I demand recognition. The tears they might have expected never materialized. Instead, a profound, crystalline clarity washed over me, the familial bond, that invisible tether I had bled to maintain, dissolved into ash right then and there. I smiled. It was a terrifyingly calm expression. I reached out and gently placed my glass of sparkling water onto the silver coaster resting on the side table. The soft clink of the glass against the metal was the only sound I made as I stood up. "Merry Christmas," I said evenly. I smoothed the skirt of my dress and walked toward the grand foyer. I retrieved my wool coat from the cloakroom myself. I opened the heavy oak door and stepped out into the biting Rhode Island winter night. I did not look back at the warm, golden glow of the windows. I did not shed a single tear as the freezing wind whipped my hair across my face. I simply walked toward my car, the gravel crunching beneath my heels. By the time I slid into the driver's seat and turned the ignition, the fragile illusion of family was dead, and in its place, my mind had already begun meticulously drafting a list. The heater in my sedan hummed a low, steady rhythm, pushing warm air against the freezing chill of the Rhode Island night. The drive to my apartment in Boston would take nearly 2 hours. It was a long, desolate stretch of interstate enveloped in utter darkness, giving my mind ample room to dissect the evening. I kept my hands at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, my posture as rigid as it had been on the velvet settee. The physical distance between me and Wintermere House was expanding, but the ghosts of its foundation clung to me tightly. My mind drifted back exactly 5 years. The glittering facade of our family name had been hours away from complete obliteration. Wintermere House had suffered a catastrophic financial hemorrhage following a dismal holiday season. Malcolm, driven by an arrogance that vastly outweighed his business acumen, had launched a massive renovation of the guest wings. He envisioned imported Italian marble and hand-carved mahogany panels, completely ignoring the fact that the estate lacked the liquidity to cover even the initial deposits. The costs ballooned by over 300%. Compounding the disaster, he engaged in a bitter, profoundly misguided legal battle with the local Historical Preservation Board over the removal of a protected seawall. He handled the dispute with such staggering incompetence that the resulting fines drained the last of our operational reserves. The banks had finalized the foreclosure paperwork. The end was not merely approaching. It was already sitting in our foyer. Yet, my parents continued to host their lavish, catered Sunday brunches, desperately projecting the image of an untouchable, old money dynasty. They preferred to drown in champagne rather than admit they were sinking. At that time, I was working 80-hour weeks as a senior associate in asset restructuring for the Black Mirror Recovery Group. I spent my days dissecting the rotting corpses of failed corporations. I saw the ruin coming for my family before the ink on the bank mandates had even dried. And so, operating entirely in the shadows, I stepped in to halt the execution. I did not simply write a check or beg for an extension. I orchestrated a massive, covert financial rescue. Utilizing my own private entity, North Hollow Holdings, I systematically absorbed the most toxic of my father's liabilities. I sat across from ruthless credit managers and renegotiated the crushing debt structures. I personally guaranteed the holiday credit lines, pouring my own hard-earned capital into the breach to save the Wintermere brand from being auctioned off in pieces to a mass-market hospitality conglomerate. But the true bedrock of my hidden authority came from a much older source. The actual founder and visionary behind the Wintermere empire had never been my father. It was his paternal aunt, Estelle Ravenswood. Estelle was a woman forged from iron and frost. In the final 6 months of her life, as illness confined her to her bed, she watched Malcolm's reckless mismanagement with mounting disgust. She knew his vanity would eventually burn her legacy to the ground. Estelle summoned me to her chambers one evening, the room smelling of camphor and impending death. With absolute clarity and total secrecy, she executed a series of legal maneuvers that circumvented her nephew entirely. She transferred the direct guardianship of the holiday brand, the exclusive event licenses, and several crucial operational veto powers into my name. She did not do this out of sentimental affection. She did it because she recognized that I was the only Ravenswood who possessed the cold. Calculating discipline required to keep the estate standing. She realized I was the vault, while my father was merely the display window. Malcolm never understood the magnitude of his own salvation. His monumental ego actively prevented him from grasping the truth. He possessed a vague, hazy notion that his eldest daughter had stepped in to help with some tedious legal paperwork. I would place towering stacks of complex restructuring documents on his desk, and he would hastily scratch his signature across the bottom lines without reading a single paragraph. He was completely oblivious to the mechanisms of his rescue. He only knew that the aggressive phone calls from creditors had miraculously stopped, and he accepted this sudden peace as his natural right. He believed the universe had simply righted itself for a man of his stature. My reward for serving as the invisible architect of their survival was a permanent demotion to family pariah. I was routinely dismissed as dry, intensely unapproachable, and severely lacking in feminine grace. My mother openly lamented my refusal to wear bright colors or participate in the shallow, sycophantic games of local high society. I did not flatter the right politicians. I did not smile brightly for the society pages. I completely refused to play the role of the dutiful, ornamental princess of a storied heritage. That role belonged exclusively to Ivy. My younger sister was raised to be the living, breathing symbol of the Ravenswood legacy. She was beautiful, effortlessly charming, and fiercely protected from the ugly realities of our ledgers. Her face graced the covers of regional lifestyle magazines, often accompanied by fawning articles declaring her the true soul of Wintermere. It was an intensely bitter irony. The woman celebrated as the guardian of our heritage possessed zero comprehension of the financial architecture keeping a roof over her head. She spent her days approving floral arrangements and posting curated photographs, wholly unaware that she was dancing on a stage I had bought and paid for. For half a decade, I had absorbed their subtle cruelties. I endured being treated like an embarrassing obligation at the dinner table. I swallowed the passive-aggressive commentary regarding my career and my solitary life. I rationalized it as the cost of protecting the family name. But tonight, The rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. As the Boston skyline finally pierced the dark horizon, glowing with thousands of cold, indifferent lights, the true agony of the evening settled deep into my bones. The burning sensation in my throat was not born from the petty desire for a wrapped box or a superficial token of gratitude. The absolute devastation stemmed from the staggering cruelty of their orchestration. They had not simply forgotten to buy me a present. That would have been a mere oversight. Instead, my parents and my sister had meticulously coordinated a grand public ceremony of giving, specifically designed to look right through me. It was a deliberate ritual of erasure. They used the season of warmth and family to unequivocally confirm that, within the walls I had sacrificed my youth to protect, I simply did not exist. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the leather press hard against my palms. They wanted me to be invisible. They wanted me to be a phantom haunting the edges of their perfect, wealthy lives. As I navigated the empty city streets toward my apartment building, a profound, icy calm washed over my grief. If they truly believed I was nothing but a ghost, they were about to discover exactly what happens when the foundation you live upon decides to simply vanish. The key turned in the lock of my Boston apartment at exactly 1:15 in the morning. The silence inside was a stark contrast to the oppressive, forced cheer of Newport. I did not head for the liquor cabinet to pour a stiff drink. I did not pick up my phone to tearfully vent to a friend, nor did I allow myself the luxury of an emotional breakdown. I bypassed the wreckage of rejection entirely. I stripped off the midnight blue silk, hanging it carefully in the closet, and changed into a thick cashmere sweater and loose trousers. I walked into the kitchen, put the kettle on the stove, and brewed a strong cup of black tea. I carried the steaming mug to my mahogany desk, flipped open my laptop, and began the cold, surgical process of reconstructing the entire operational history of our estate over the last 5 years. For the next several hours, my screen illuminated the dark room with complex spreadsheets, legal PDFs, and corporate bank statements. I methodically cataloged the invisible scaffolding I had built to keep their world from collapsing. I reviewed the winter operating credit line I had personally guaranteed to the tune of $2.5 million. I read through the brutal, exhausting negotiations I had waged with the high-end furniture suppliers who had threatened to seize the antique fixtures when the invoices went unpaid for 90 days. I pulled up the exact email chains where I had smoothed over the catastrophic zoning violations for the outdoor event spaces, preventing the county from shutting down our most profitable season. I reread the dense insurance restructuring agreements and the frantic legal appeals I had filed to prevent the state historical preservation grant from being permanently revoked due to gross managerial negligence. Every single document was a testament to my silent, unacknowledged labor. It was around 3:30 in the morning when the numbers stopped aligning. I was auditing the master ledger for the Memorial Fund. It was a restricted charitable trust established by my great-aunt, legally bound by a strict charter to be used exclusively for the architectural preservation of the estate and for a series of local community scholarships. The fund was sacred, or at least, it was supposed to be. As my eyes tracked across the spreadsheet, I noticed a pattern of steady, unauthorized bleeds. Large, round sums had been diverted into entirely unrelated corporate accounts over the past 18 months. I traced the routing numbers through the shell companies. A substantial withdrawal of $45,000 had been funneled directly to the boutique public relations firm that managed the wardrobe and styling team for my younger sister. Another $20,000 went towards settling the exorbitant tabs for private client dinners hosted at five-star restaurants in Manhattan. I even found a staggering $75,000 siphoned off to finance a glossy, aggressive media campaign. That campaign was designed specifically to butter up a national retail partner for a commercial licensing deal my father had been desperately and secretly pursuing. They were using a restricted charitable trust as their own personal slush fund to finance their vanity projects. The betrayal of the trust was sickening, but the next discovery froze the blood in my veins. I opened the quarterly compliance confirmation forms submitted to the state charity board. These documents legally required the signature of the primary trustee to authorize the disbursements and certify their charitable nature. At the bottom of 4 separate, highly illegal filings. My digital signature stared back at me. I immediately cross-referenced the dates with my encrypted corporate login logs. On the exact days those documents were signed and time-stamped, I had been in London closing a corporate merger for my restructuring firm. I had not even accessed the domestic servers, let alone authorized those transfers. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This was no longer a matter of an ungrateful, callous family taking my financial sacrifices for granted. This was a sprawling, coordinated structure of corporate fraud, embezzlement, and blatant forgery. They had actively hijacked my legal standing. They were operating under the dangerously arrogant assumption that my desperate, pathetic need for familial approval would guarantee my silence indefinitely. They believed I would simply absorb the legal liability to protect the family name, just as I had absorbed their disdain. I picked up my phone. It was just before dawn, but I knew my private attorney would answer. Marina Vale was a brilliant, cutthroat lawyer who had spent the last 3 years repeatedly urging me to drag the estate into strict legal compliance. I had always refused, citing the delicate nature of family dynamics, shielding them from the harsh consequences of their own arrogance. The phone rang twice before she picked up, her voice sharp and alert despite the ungodly hour. I laid out the discoveries in a flat, clinical tone. I did not shed a tear. I detailed the diverted charitable funds, the fraudulent commercial campaigns, and the forged electronic signatures. I did not ask for her advice or her sympathy. I gave her a set of absolute, uncompromising directives. I instructed Marina to draft an immediate, simultaneous legal strike package. First, she was to issue a cease and desist, entirely suspending their rights to utilize the holiday festival brand name, imagery, and associated trademarks. Second, she was to contact the primary commercial lender the moment their offices opened and formally withdraw my personal guarantee backing the seasonal credit lines, exposing them to immediate margin calls. Third, I ordered her to file the emergency paperwork with the State Attorney General to trigger a hostile, independent audit of the Memorial Fund. Finally, she was to draft a formal notice terminating all of their operational privileges effective immediately, citing gross violations of the guardianship clauses and breach of fiduciary duty. Marina listened to the entire litany of instructions in silence. When I finally finished, she let out a slow breath. She simply asked how fast I wanted the paperwork served. I closed the ledger on my screen, the blue light reflecting in my tired but relentlessly awake eyes. I told her to finalize the courier arrangements for the first light of day. Before I closed my laptop and finally prepared to lie down, I sent Marina one final brief text message. Tomorrow morning, I want them to open their presents. The morning of the 26th of December broke with a brittle, freezing clarity across New England. While I sat in the absolute quiet of my Boston kitchen, nursing my second cup of tea, a meticulously planned sequence of events was already unfolding 70 miles away. I did not need to be standing in the grand foyer of our Newport estate to see it happen. I had studied the architecture of my family's vanity for 34 years. I knew precisely how the dominoes would fall. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, a private courier ascended the stone steps of the estate. He carried a single, substantial package. I had specified the presentation with the same cold precision I applied to my corporate takeovers. It was a pristine silver box, bound tightly by a thick, jet-black velvet ribbon. It arrived just as the household was gathering for their crucial morning strategy meeting regarding a lucrative national brand partnership. I knew my sister would be the one to claim the package. Ivy was conditioned to believe that anything wrapped in silver and delivered by hand was a tribute meant for her. I could easily picture her perfectly manicured hands pulling the black ribbon, a triumphant smile on her face. She undoubtedly assumed it was a luxurious preemptive thank you gift from the corporate executives she was supposed to dazzle later that week for her holiday legacy collection. She expected silk scarves, perhaps a piece of fine jewelry, or an imported leather good. Instead, the heavy lid gave way to reveal no silk and no gold. Resting at the bottom of the box was a dense, 200-page stack of bound legal documents, a single brass administrative key for the master file safe, and a cover letter printed on the heavy, intimidating letterhead of Marina Vale. According to the frantic, fragmented timeline I pieced together later from the digital fallout, my father snatched the documents from Ivy's hands the moment she recoiled in confusion. Malcolm always needed to be the one in control of the narrative. I could visualize his handsome, arrogant face hardening as his eyes scanned the summary page. By the time he reached the second page, the blood must have drained entirely from his cheeks. The legal language was devoid of any familial warmth. It was a brutal, surgical strike. It formally notified him that the operational rights for the upcoming early year events were suspended immediately due to gross violations of fiduciary duty. It explicitly stated that the massive personal credit guarantee I had maintained to keep their seasonal vendors afloat was officially withdrawn, leaving them exposed to immediate collections. Furthermore, it warned that any public statement or commercial endeavor using the festival brand would require my express written approval. My mother, hovering over his shoulder, would have instinctively reached for the pages detailing the financial restructuring. Celeste always had an acute sense for danger when it concerned her own social standing. When she read the section demanding an immediate, independent forensic audit of the Estelle Memorial Fund, the remaining air in the room surely vanished. She knew exactly what a deep dive into those ledgers would reveal. She knew the vanity projects, the unauthorized styling fees, and the fabricated public relations expenses could never be cleanly explained to a state investigator. I knew my mother well enough to know she likely collapsed into the nearest antique chair. The reality of her impending social and legal ruin finally crashing down upon her. Standing amidst this sudden, chaotic implosion was Declan. The impeccably groomed fiancé had bought into the illusion of marrying into a dynasty of untouchable, old money grace. For the very first time, the heavy velvet curtains were pulled back, revealing the rotting wood and rusted nails holding the stage together. The illusion shattered completely when Malcolm, his voice devoid of its usual aristocratic smooth cadence, barked out a desperate, panicking demand to the room, asking who had given me the right to do this to him. The sheer terror in my father's voice was the ultimate betrayal of their carefully curated image. The retaliation began exactly as I anticipated. My phone, resting on the granite countertop of my kitchen, lit up. The first incoming call was from my sister. I let it ring. I could practically hear the venom and disdain in her voice, furious that I had dared to interrupt her ascending trajectory. I did not answer. Then came the barrage from my father. He called 3 times in rapid succession. The screen went dark, then immediately illuminated again. 7 times, then 11 times. I watched the numbers climb, each missed call a testament to a man realizing the steering wheel was no longer connected to the engine. I did not pick up. A notification chimed, signaling a voicemail from my mother. I listened to it once, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of panic and her trademark manipulation. She accused me of being spiteful, bitterly complaining that I had deliberately ruined the post-holiday joy for everyone. She demanded I call her back to fix this misunderstanding. Completely ignoring the federal crimes she had committed in my name, I deleted the message immediately. I glanced at the digital clock on my wall. It was just after 9. A soft ping echoed from my laptop. It was a secure email from Marina. The message was brief and ruthlessly efficient. She confirmed that the physical documents had been signed for at the estate. More importantly, she attached the official confirmation from the commercial bank. The financial institution had successfully received and processed the withdrawal of my personal credit guarantee. The financial safety net was officially gone. The final, devastating blow of the morning did not even come from my attorney. It came less than an hour later, courtesy of the very corporate machine my father had tried to impress using my stolen signature. A priority email was dispatched to the estate's main administrative inbox, to which I still retained covert, read-only access. It was a formal notification from the national commercial partner. The language was polite, but entirely unyielding. They were officially canceling the highly anticipated test shoot scheduled at the estate for that afternoon. Their legal department had flagged severe anomalies in the contract submissions, citing an urgent need to clarify the true ownership rights of the location and the associated branding images. They were pulling out. I closed the email window and finally took a sip of my tea. It had gone slightly cold, but it tasted like absolute victory. For the first time in their privileged, insulated lives, the entire Ravenswood family was looking down and realizing that the polished hardwood floor beneath their feet had vanished, leaving them suspended over a terrifying, bottomless drop. It was exactly 4:30 the following afternoon when the security intercom in my kitchen buzzed. The heavy coastal snow from the morning had turned the Boston streets into a gray, frozen slush, but the four people standing on the small screen of my monitor looked as though they had just stepped out of a private, heated town car. Malcolm, Celeste, Ivy, and Declan had bypassed my building's front desk by slipping into the lobby behind a delivery worker. They arrived unannounced, carrying themselves with the distinct, arrogant posture of individuals who fundamentally believed that boundaries, appointments, and basic rules of conduct were concepts meant exclusively for other people. I pressed the silver button to unlock the secure elevator. I did not offer them coats, tea, or a place to sit when I opened my heavy front door. They stepped into my minimalist, glass-walled living room, their opulent cashmere coats and designer scarves looking absurdly out of place against the stark, modern lines of my space. My father did not waste a single second on pleasantries. He remained standing in the exact center of the room, taking up as much oxygen as possible. He immediately launched into his offensive, adopting the condescending, booming voice he usually reserved for reprimanding junior staff members who had made a minor error. He demanded I cease this childish game immediately. He waved a dismissive hand toward the windows, labeling the absolute legal devastation I had unleashed that morning as a massive, hysterical overreaction to a simple holiday misunderstanding. He spoke of the family reputation, insisting that my emotional outburst was jeopardizing decades of carefully cultivated social capital and putting unnecessary stress on the estate. I leaned against the edge of my quartz kitchen island, crossing my arms over my chest. My voice was entirely flat, completely stripped of any daughterly deference or warmth. I asked him very calmly which misunderstanding he was referring to. I wanted to know if he meant the part where I was intentionally excluded from the gift exchange, or if he meant the part where my mother explicitly stated I was only useful when the foundation of the estate was about to collapse. My mother stepped forward, her perfectly painted lips set in a tight, angry line. She instantly pivoted her strategy, attempting to rewrite the history of the previous night. She adopted a tone of exhausted patience, claiming it had merely been a long evening, that everyone had been deeply fatigued from the charity gala, and that I was simply being far too sensitive. I looked directly into her cold eyes. I told her that the most deeply cruel, toxic families in the world always love to weaponize that specific word. They inflict pain, they isolate, they diminish, and then they have the sheer audacity to call the resulting bleeding a symptom of sensitivity. The absolute, unbothered calm in my delivery shattered whatever thin veneer of patience my younger sister possessed. Ivy threw her hands up, her expensive leather handbag slipping from her shoulder and hitting the hardwood floor. She loudly blurted out that I was just bitter. She accused me of being chronically jealous because I had never been pretty enough or charming enough to be the face of anything, let alone the legacy of our family. The room fell suddenly, terrifyingly quiet after her outburst. I did not look at Ivy. I looked at Declan. The handsome, polished finance executive was staring at his fiancé. The adoring, indulgent look he usually reserved for her was entirely gone. In its place was the very first, undeniable spark of deep suspicion. He was a man trained to assess risk, to look for the hidden liabilities in a portfolio, and he was finally looking at the raw, unedited version of the asset he was preparing to acquire. I did not engage in a screaming match with my sister. I had zero interest in dragging this out or defending my aesthetic value. I stood up straight and delivered the final parameters of our new reality. I stated clearly that every single legal term outlined in the morning delivery was now in full effect. I informed them that any and all future communication must be routed exclusively through my legal counsel. Then, I lowered my voice, ensuring every syllable landed with the weight of a gavel. I warned them that if anyone in that room ever continued to use my name to sign, verify, or authorize another compliance document. The resulting consequences would no longer be handled quietly at the family level. It would become a matter for federal prosecutors. Malcolm took 2 heavy, aggressive steps toward me, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate me into submission. He dropped his voice to a low, threatening rumble, trying to invoke the authority of a patriarch he had long since forfeited. He told me that every ounce of status, wealth, and respect I commanded in this city was solely due to the Ravenswood name. I did not back away. I held his furious gaze and replied that it was precisely because I understood exactly how much that name was truly worth that I absolutely refused to let him continue hollowing it out from the inside. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, a quiet but distinctly clear voice broke the tension. Declan stepped out from behind Ivy's shadow. He looked around the room, his brow deeply furrowed, and asked a single, devastating question. He asked to know, right then and there, what exactly Ava was holding over them. Not one of the other 3 dared to answer him immediately. The silence stretched, thick and overwhelmingly guilty. When they finally turned to leave my apartment, the dynamic of their united front had irrevocably shifted. Celeste practically floated to the door, desperately clinging to her aristocratic poise as if it were a life raft. Malcolm squared his shoulders, trying to project a commanding power that had already been brutally stripped from him. Ivy lifted her chin, clutching her pride like a shield to mask her panic. But as the heavy door clicked shut behind them, Declan was the only one who walked away with the haunted, pale expression of a man who had just realized he was preparing to marry into a massive, heavily leveraged lie. Within 48 hours of their departure from my living room, the Newport gossip machinery was operating at maximum capacity. The town thrived on the scent of fresh scandal, and my father served them a feast. Malcolm did not retreat into the shadows. He deployed the only defense mechanism he truly understood. He began a systematic, aggressive campaign to rewrite the narrative from the ground up. He scheduled prolonged, highly visible lunches with our extended relatives, key logistics partners, and the executive board members of the Regional Charity Coalition. To each captive audience, he spun a tragic, deeply convincing tale of a successful daughter suddenly unraveling. He painted me as a woman pathologically obsessed with absolute control, driven to madness by an unnatural, deep-seated jealousy of her radiant younger sister. He assured the local power brokers that my aggressive legal actions were merely the erratic lashings out of someone suffering a severe emotional breakdown, and that he, the benevolent and long-suffering patriarch, was simply attempting to manage a very private family tragedy before it affected the community. My mother engaged in a far more subtle and devastating form of social warfare. Celeste spent her afternoons making strategic phone calls from her private sitting room to every influential socialite and committee chairwoman in the Eastern Seaboard's elite circles. She did not yell, nor did she issue demands. Instead, she weaponized her own carefully maintained fragility. She cultivated the persona of a heartbroken, bewildered mother. She wept quietly over the telephone lines, speaking in hushed tones about a daughter who had grown incomprehensibly cold, fiercely ungrateful, and alarmingly hungry for power. She planted seeds of doubt in every manicured garden in town. Ivy, remaining true to her intensely curated nature, took the battle directly to the digital realm. Over the course of 3 days, she populated her heavily followed online platforms with black and white photographs accompanied by passive-aggressive, pseudo-inspirational text. She posted lengthy captions lamenting the profound toxicity of women who actively weaponize their financial success against their own flesh and blood. She mused poetically to her hundreds of thousands of followers about the tragedy of deeply insecure individuals who become utterly destructive the moment they realize they cannot be the center of attention. However, their desperately coordinated assault achieved the exact opposite of its intended effect. The wealthy residents of Newport were incredibly perceptive when it came to the scent of old money bleeding out. Instead of smothering the crisis under a thick blanket of manufactured sympathy, my family's frantic overcompensation acted as a distress flare illuminating a sinking ship. A local, highly circulated society blog, previously dedicated exclusively to critiquing floral arrangements at summer galas and detailing country club menus, suddenly shifted its editorial focus. On the morning of the 29th of December, they published a short, fiercely speculative article. The headline consisted of a single, highly dangerous question: who actually controls the Wintermere holiday empire? That specific question was already burning a hole through the mind of the man preparing to marry into their grand illusion. Declan was far from a fool. He was a senior analyst at a prominent family investment fund, a man trained specifically to identify buried liabilities and discrepancies in high-stakes portfolios. Prior to the catastrophe, my father had heavily implied that Declan could become a primary co-investor in a massive, multi-million-dollar national expansion of the festival brand following the spring wedding. Operating in complete silence and entirely outside the view of his fiancé, Declan bypassed the glamorous surface and dug directly into the actual corporate filings. He pulled the polished, high-gloss investment pitch deck Malcolm had confidently handed him a month prior. He laid those glossy pages side by side with the publicly available tax records and operational filings of the estate he had requested from a contact at the state registry. The contradictions were glaring and immediate. The pitch deck presented a streamlined, autonomous ownership structure commanded entirely and exclusively by my father. The public records, however, revealed a tangled, heavily restricted web of guardianship clauses and memorial fund bylaws that directly contradicted Malcolm's claims of absolute authority. For the very first time, Declan realized the sprawling financial empire he was being invited to buy into was fundamentally a mirage held together by lies. While Declan was unearthing the structural rot from the outside, I received a piece of evidence that escalated the conflict from petty civil disputes straight into criminal territory. It arrived in my inbox at exactly 11:15 at night. The sender address was a string of encrypted, randomized letters, untraceable and silent. Attached to the blank email was a high-resolution scanned copy of an internal municipal document. It was the official city application requesting a comprehensive, multi-year extension of the Winter Festival operating licenses. I stared at the screen, my jaw clenching so hard my teeth ached. The application was dated less than 2 weeks prior. It listed my name as the primary guarantor and utilized my specific professional credentials to secure the municipal approvals. I had never been consulted regarding the extension, and I had certainly never signed the physical document. They had blatantly forged my authorization on official government paperwork to keep the festival running while simultaneously planning to erase me from the family narrative. I forwarded the scanned document directly to Marina Vale without a single word of commentary. We convened via a secure video call the next morning at exactly 7 o'clock. Marina's expression on the screen was grim, entirely devoid of her usual sharp humor, and highly focused. She did not offer comfort. She offered tactical, devastating strikes. She advised me to initiate an immediate, two-pronged counteroffensive, utilizing both aggressive legal channels and a ruthless strategic public relations defense. She explicitly ordered me not to engage in any public arguments, to ignore the society blog, and to refrain from posting any social media rebuttals. We were to remain silent and let the subpoenaed documents do all the screaming. Furthermore, she issued a stark, terrifying warning. She told me to prepare for the reality that my family was backing themselves into a corner, and cornered animals do not play by the rules. She warned me they were preparing to go much, much further than mere insults and character assassination. Sitting at my desk as the harsh morning sun hit the glass panes of my office, a profound, chilling realization finally settled completely over me. For years, I had secretly held on to a microscopic sliver of hope that exposing their financial incompetence would force a moment of genuine, humbling reckoning. I thought being confronted with the undeniable, paper-trailed truth of their failures might finally break through their towering arrogance. But looking at the forged municipal application and watching the systematic deployment of their lies across the entire town, I understood the fundamental, unchangeable nature of the people I shared blood with. When a man like my father feels his grip on absolute power beginning to slip away, He does not reflect on his mistakes. He does not seek redemption, and he absolutely never, ever apologizes. Instead, he simply decides to fabricate an entirely new reality, entirely willing to destroy anyone who dares to point out the truth. Marina's warning materialized faster than even she had anticipated. On the afternoon of the 28th of December, a thick sealed envelope arrived at Marina's downtown office via an independent process server. It was the official legal response from the formidable, wildly expensive corporate firm Malcolm had retained. When Marina forwarded the digitized packet to my secure server, the sheer audacity of their defense strategy briefly stunned me. They were not attempting to negotiate or settle. They were attempting an absolute brazen erasure of reality. The primary motion filed by my father's counsel asserted that the legal guardianship of the festival brand and the transfer of the exclusive event licenses were never intended to grant me actual, permanent control. They formally classified the entire restructuring as a temporary family arrangement, a mere logistical convenience designed to bypass temporary credit hurdles 5 years ago. To support this staggering lie, the packet contained a fabricated alternate history. There were dozens of pages of backdated minutes from family board meetings that had never occurred. There was a newly discovered addendum to the original trust documents, supposedly signed by Estelle Ravenswood shortly before her passing, vaguely restricting the guardian's power in favor of the patriarch. Most damning of all, the file included an electronic document, purportedly drafted by me 3 years prior, explicitly acknowledging my role as a temporary placeholder. At the bottom of that page sat a flawless, digitally simulated replica of my signature. Marina and I were on a secure line as we reviewed the final page. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the server banks in my office. Then, Marina spoke, her voice stripped of all its usual professional detachment. She stated a single, chilling fact. They forged it. I did not panic. Panic is an emotion reserved for people who do not understand the architecture of the systems they operate within. I simply disconnected the call, sat back in my ergonomic chair, and initiated a total forensic sweep of my own archives. I spent the next 6 hours pulling every piece of digital collateral I had accumulated over the past half-decade. I downloaded the redundant server backups containing the unalterable metadata of the original agreements. I extracted the chronological edit histories from our legacy legal software. I even retrieved the encrypted, time-stamped video feeds from the estate's basement archive room, where the physical copies of Estelle's trust were kept under lock and key. I gathered the original bank transfer vouchers from 5 years ago, proving my capital was the sole anchor of the rescue. As I was meticulously compiling the counter-evidence, an unexpected variable fundamentally altered the trajectory of the war. Later that night, my private cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed a blocked number, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was Nora Quill. Nora had been the head accountant for Wintermere House for over 2 decades, a fiercely loyal, quiet woman who had practically worshipped my great-aunt Estelle. She spoke in a rushed, terrified whisper, begging for a private meeting away from the estate and completely off the record. I met Nora an hour later in the dimly lit, nearly empty parking lot of a 24-hour diner halfway between Newport and Boston. The freezing wind whipped around us as she climbed into the passenger seat of my sedan. She looked exhausted, her hands trembling as she clutched a small, heavily padded envelope. Nora did not waste time with apologies. She reached into the envelope and handed me a solid-state hard drive. She explained, her voice cracking with suppressed anxiety, that the drive contained the complete, unaltered shadow backups of the master financial ledgers spanning the last 48 months. It also contained the raw access logs for the estate's primary server, but the most vital piece of data she handed over was a locally stored video file. Nora had maintained a hidden, secondary security camera in the main study, a precaution she had installed years ago to protect herself from Malcolm's chaotic record-keeping. The video she transferred to me was time-stamped the 25th of December, late in the evening, hours after I had walked out into the cold. The footage clearly showed my father and my sister, Ivy, sitting at the mahogany desk, frantically altering digital files and feeding original trust addendums into a cross-cut shredder. Nora stared out the frost-covered windshield and confessed her sins. She admitted she had stayed silent for far too long, paralyzed by the fear of losing her pension and her livelihood. However, the final line had been crossed when she realized Malcolm was actively dragging Estelle's sacred name into a filthy, desperate forgery scheme. She could not stand by and watch the legacy of the woman she respected most be weaponized to destroy the only family member who actually possessed Estelle's competence. I secured the drive in my locked briefcase, thanked Nora with a promise of absolute legal immunity and financial protection, and drove back to the city. My pulse was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of impending victory. The night was not over. Just past midnight, my phone vibrated against the console of my car. It was Declan. He was not calling to act as a peacemaker or a mediator. The sharp, polished edge of the finance executive was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, calculating tone of a man who realized he had almost been defrauded. He called to confirm a single, critical piece of intelligence. During a closed-door meeting the previous week, Malcolm had aggressively leveraged Declan's name and the massive financial backing of his family's investment firm to secure the national partnership deal. Malcolm had guaranteed the corporate executives that Declan's capital would fund the expansion, all while deliberately concealing the true ownership structure and the impending legal apocalypse. As I pulled into my underground parking garage, I mentally cataloged the arsenal I had acquired in a single evening. The balance of power had violently shifted. I no longer just possessed a solid legal defense against their fraudulent claims. With Nora's hard drive, I held irrefutable, technical proof of multiple felonies. With Declan, I possessed a highly credible, hostile witness from outside the immediate bloodline, a man whose own formidable legal team would happily tear Malcolm apart for attempting to drag his family fund into a fraudulent commercial venture. The scale was no longer just tipping in the courtroom. It was heavily weighted with a devastating truth that, when finally detonated, would leave the Wintermere illusion as nothing more than a pile of burning ash in the public square. The summons arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. My father's tone over the phone was sickeningly smooth, completely devoid of the panic he had exhibited days earlier. He requested I return to the estate so we could sit down and resolve the situation like a family, before things escalated beyond repair. Sitting across from my desk, Marina immediately identified the tactic. It was a classic pressure play, designed to isolate the rogue element and suffocate them with manufactured sentimentality. I agreed to the meeting, but I did not walk into the trap entirely unprotected. When my sedan pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the estate, I left the engine running. I instructed Marina to remain in the passenger seat. Leaving my attorney physically parked outside the perimeter was a deliberate psychological maneuver. It fed their delusion that I was vulnerable enough to be swayed by emotion, while simultaneously serving as a highly visible reminder of the legal guillotine poised directly above their necks. I walked through the heavy oak doors and stepped into the exact same grand parlor where the gift exchange had occurred. The towering spruce still dominated the room, its silver ornaments reflecting the glow of the fireplace, but the underlying atmosphere was fundamentally different. The opulent surroundings now felt like the velvet lining of a casket. Malcolm stood by the mantel, attempting to project the magnanimous aura of a forgiving king. He gestured to the empty velvet settee, but I remained standing. He laid out his grand compromise. If I agreed to lift the injunctions and allow the winter operations to continue unhindered through the end of the season, the family would formally, yet entirely privately, acknowledge my contributions. He offered a closed-door apology and a quiet restructuring of the internal hierarchy. He wanted to buy my silence with the exact same invisible currency he had been paying me with for my entire adult life. Before I could dissect the sheer arrogance of his offer, my mother intervened. Celeste glided across the Persian rug, her expression a mask of conspiratorial warmth. She requested my father give us a moment alone. Once he stepped into the adjoining dining room, she revealed a secondary, infinitely more toxic compromise. She lowered her voice to a hushed whisper. offering to permanently sideline Malcolm from all internal financial decisions. She promised to hand me the operational reins in secret, provided I immediately squash the forensic audit of the memorial fund and ensure Ivy retained her lucrative image contracts. Then, Celeste delivered the twist that finally illuminated the darkest corners of my family's architecture. She looked me dead in the eye and casually admitted that she had known the truth about the legal guardianship for years. She had been fully aware that Estelle had bypassed Malcolm and handed the keys to the empire directly to me. I stared at her perfectly preserved face, the realization settling over me like a sheet of ice. I asked her why she had never spoken up, why she had allowed me to be treated like an embarrassing burden when she knew I owned the very floor she stood on. Her answer was a masterclass in aristocratic cruelty. She explained, without a single trace of remorse, that an unacknowledged, invisible daughter working desperately for scraps of affection is far easier to control than a daughter who understands her own absolute power. My mother had not simply been a passive participant in my humiliation, she had been the primary architect. She actively maintained my role as the undervalued outsider specifically to preserve the fragile balance of power within the house. She sacrificed her eldest child's dignity to keep her own kingdom intact. The sheer weight of that revelation was broken by the sound of a raised voice. Ivy stormed into the parlor, having apparently listened from the hallway. Her face was flushed, her perfect composure entirely destroyed. She launched into a hysterical tirade. She screamed that I was a monster, violently accusing me of intentionally destroying her upcoming spring wedding, incinerating her personal brand, and ruining her entire life out of pure, unadulterated spite. I did not raise my voice. I did not move a single muscle. I looked at my younger sister, watching her hyperventilate over the potential loss of a crown she had never actually earned. I asked her one simple, devastating question. Are you losing what is yours, or are you just losing what you thought was yours? Ivy froze, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. She had no answer, because answering truthfully would require acknowledging that her entire existence was subsidized by my silent labor. I turned my back on both of them and walked out of the parlor. I had heard enough. There was no family left to save, only a toxic ecosystem that needed to be permanently dismantled. However, as I navigated the long, dimly lit hallway toward the front entrance, I paused near the heavy mahogany doors of my father's private study. They were slightly ajar. I could hear Malcolm speaking rapidly into his cell phone. He was talking to the primary event manager. The words drifting through the crack in the door eradicated any remaining hesitation in my chest. He was explicitly instructing the manager to push forward with the massive brand partnership announcement scheduled for New Year's Eve. He ordered them to ignore the pending legal injunctions and proceed with the press conference, assuring the manager that the paperwork issues were simply a minor internal delay that would be resolved momentarily. He had zero intention of honoring any agreement, public or private. He was planning to stand in front of flashing cameras and wealthy investors on the final night of the year and actively sell a fraudulent narrative. I pushed open the heavy front door and stepped back out into the freezing coastal air, the gravel crunching sharply under my boots. The estate behind me was still wrapped in thousands of beautiful, twinkling lights, but I finally saw it for what it truly was. It was a massive, glittering trap. As I opened the passenger door of my sedan and met Marina's expectant gaze, I understood the fundamental shift in my own objective. This war was no longer about reclaiming my stolen dignity or forcing an apology from people incapable of remorse. It was time to permanently shut down a massive, predatory fraud packaged in the guise of a beloved holiday tradition. The moment I relayed Malcolm's intercepted phone call to Marina, our strategy shifted from a measured legal siege to an all-out, breathless sprint. There was no longer time for a slow, methodical strangulation of their resources. We had exactly 3 days before the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve, and Marina deployed every weapon in her arsenal simultaneously. She immediately filed a motion for an emergency injunction in federal court to permanently block the upcoming brand partnership announcement, citing ongoing investigations into severe corporate fraud and forged municipal applications. Simultaneously, she dispatched formal, heavily documented demands to both the State Historical Preservation Board and the independent council overseeing charitable trusts. She officially requested they launch their own separate hostile investigations into Wintermere House and freeze all related assets until the inquiry concluded. My father, feeling the walls of his empire rapidly closing in around him, launched his most desperate counterattack yet. He completely abandoned his previous narrative of a private family misunderstanding and went on the absolute offensive. Through his remaining public relations contacts, he began aggressively pushing the story that I was an unstable, deeply vindictive woman actively trying to murder my own family's legacy out of sheer personal spite. To put a beautiful, tragic face to his fabricated lies, he orchestrated a primetime sit-down interview for Ivy on one of the state's biggest local TV networks. She was slated to sit under the bright studio lights, wearing a designer dress paid for by stolen funds, and weep about how her own flesh and blood was ruthlessly destroying her future and her impending spring wedding. But Malcolm severely underestimated the intelligence and the self-preservation instincts of the man he was trying to use as a prop. 2 hours before Ivy was scheduled to sit in the makeup chair for the live broadcast, Declan executed his own brutal, highly public exit strategy. He did not ask for a family meeting to discuss his feelings, and he certainly did not engage in a screaming match. He simply packed his belongings, moved completely out of the luxury townhouse he shared with my sister, and publicly called off the engagement. He left Ivy a single, devastatingly brief text message. He stated clearly that he could not, and would not, tie his entire life and his family's impeccable reputation to a dynasty that sold absolute lies disguised as holiday tradition. The news of the shattered engagement did not stay quiet for even an hour. It leaked to the press almost instantly, catching fire across every local social media platform and society blog. The narrative my father had so desperately tried to control instantly spiraled entirely out of his grasp. The digital crowds were no longer focusing on the tragic tale of a jealous older sister. Instead, the collective internet began asking one massive, undeniable question. If the Wintermere Empire was truly as financially solid and socially prestigious as the Ravenswood patriarch claimed, why was the wealthy, highly connected future son-in-law running for the exits at full speed? While my family's public image was disintegrating in real time, our legal foundation became virtually indestructible. Nora officially submitted the duplicate hard drive containing the true financial ledgers directly into Marina's custody. More importantly, the quiet, historically terrified accountant finally found her courage. She formally agreed to take the stand under oath. She promised to testify that the restricted memorial funds had been systematically misappropriated for several months under the direct, explicit orders of both Celeste and Malcolm, completely destroying their defense of ignorance. Then came the final, profound twist that elevated this war from a bitter financial dispute to a righteous execution of ultimate justice. While meticulously scouring the physical boxes of Estelle's archived legal documents, Marina discovered a heavy, wax-sealed envelope hidden at the bottom of a storage crate. It was not a hidden will or a secret financial trust. It was a personal letter, written in my great-aunt's sharp, commanding handwriting, addressed specifically to the designated heir. Marina read the contents to me over the secure phone line. In the letter, Estelle explicitly outlined the true, uncompromising purpose behind her convoluted guardianship mechanism. She wrote that she always knew Malcolm possessed the capacity to place his own immense vanity far above basic human decency. She stated clearly that if the day ever came when he prioritized his fragile ego over the survival of the estate, Wintermere must be forcefully taken from his hands. I did not need to rely on the letter as a binding legal mechanism, as the forged documents and the concrete proof of financial fraud were more than enough to win in any court in the country. But holding that piece of paper transformed the fundamental nature of the battle. It was no longer just about my personal vindication or anger. It was a posthumous judgment delivered directly by the founder herself. The night before the emergency injunction hearing, I lay wide awake in the dark of my Boston apartment. The silence of the city pressed against the glass windows. For the very first time in my adult life, I did not suppress the painful memories. I let them all wash over me like a freezing tide. I allowed myself to vividly remember every single holiday dinner where I was seated at the far end of the table, treated like a burdensome afterthought. I remembered every carefully staged family portrait where I was positioned on the very edge, easily cropped out for the glossy magazine spreads. I recalled every exhausting, agonizing time I had leveraged my own career, my own credit, and my own capital to pull them back from the brink of absolute financial ruin, only to be met with total silence instead of a simple expression of gratitude. I felt the full, suffocating weight of being the invisible pillar holding up their gilded, rotting ceiling. When the sun finally rose, casting long shadows across the city streets, I dressed in a razor-sharp charcoal gray suit. I drank my black tea, gathered my leather briefcase, and drove directly to the courthouse. As I stood on the broad concrete steps leading up to the heavy glass doors where the hearing would take place, the crisp winter wind hit my face. I looked up at the towering stone columns. I did not feel like the forgotten, unloved child, desperately seeking validation anymore. That naive woman had died permanently on Christmas Eve. I walked through the heavy doors with my spine perfectly straight, stepping into the legal arena not as a victim, but as the absolute last person sane enough to stop a parasitic, decaying tradition from continuing to wear a stolen crown. The heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom swung shut behind me on the morning of the 31st of December. It was the exact day my father had scheduled his grand champagne-soaked press conference to announce Wintermere's most lucrative holiday commercial partnership in its history. Now, that entire glittering future, along with the family's carefully manufactured reputation, hung precariously by a single legal thread. Malcolm arrived flanked by a small army of sharply dressed corporate attorneys. They looked impeccable, their suits perfectly tailored, projecting an aura of absolute, unbothered confidence. When the proceedings began, his lead counsel immediately attempted to steer the narrative into familiar, emotional territory. He stood before the judge and smoothly dismissed my injunctions as the unfortunate, exaggerated fallout of a petty family dispute, painting me as a disgruntled daughter throwing a childish tantrum over holiday grievances. Marina did not even blink. When it was her turn to speak, she completely stripped the emotion out of the room. She did not talk about feelings, neglect, or family dynamics. She built an inescapable cage out of ironclad financial evidence. She walked the judge through the extensive chain of financial bailouts I had personally orchestrated, the clear operational guardianship clauses legally binding the estate, the undeniable breaches of contract, and our formal request for a forensic audit of the charitable trust. Then, Marina delivered the first fatal strike. She submitted the technical metadata extracted from the shadow hard drive. She pointed to the projector screen, clearly demonstrating that the supposedly old family board meeting minutes were, in fact, entirely fabricated. The digital footprint proved undeniably that the documents were created late in the evening on the 25th of December, typed explicitly on my sister's personal laptop, and frantically edited multiple times before being forwarded to Malcolm's legal team. The entire courtroom watched the grand illusion of the Ravenswood legacy begin to crack. The second blow landed directly on my mother. Marina presented the undisputed banking trajectories tracing the flow of cash out of the Estelle Memorial Fund. The court reviewed the itemized list showing tens of thousands of dollars illegally diverted to fund a lavish public relations campaign, private catering, and high-end wardrobe stylists. Sitting at the defendant's table, Celeste turned an ashen, sickly shade of pale. She stared blankly ahead, entirely paralyzed by the realization that her elegant, untouchable world was crashing down, and there was absolutely no way to socially maneuver out of federal embezzlement charges. The third and final strike came from the witness stand. Declan swore the oath and calmly dismantled the last pillar of my father's defense. With the clinical precision of a senior finance executive, Declan testified that Malcolm had actively used his name and the massive investment capacity of his family's private wealth fund to aggressively reassure the national commercial partners. He stated for the public record that my father had deliberately concealed the true ownership structure of the estate while leveraging a marriage that was now permanently canceled. Desperate to regain control, Malcolm's attorney tried one last pathetic tactic. He attempted to pivot the focus back to the inciting incident, condescendingly suggesting to the judge that this entire massive legal assault was simply born from my bitter dissatisfaction over being treated poorly and not receiving a gift on Christmas Eve. That was the moment I finally broke my silence. I stood up from my chair, my voice ringing out clear and perfectly steady across the quiet courtroom. If this were simply about a forgotten gift, I would have walked away decades ago, I stated, locking eyes with my father across the aisle. The actual problem is that my family only remembers I exist when they need someone to save them from their own ruin. The gavel fell shortly after noon. The judge granted every single parameter of our emergency order. He officially suspended the commercial announcement scheduled for that evening. He legally cemented my absolute guardianship over the operational and brand controls of the festival. He formally opened an aggressive, independent investigation into the memorial fund, and he ordered Windermere House to immediately cease all unauthorized commercial activities. The final, inevitable collapse happened rapidly that same afternoon. Before I even reached my office, the national corporate partner sent a formal notice completely withdrawing from the partnership, severing all ties. A few hours later, the Municipal Preservation Board officially froze the expanded event licenses, having been notified that the compliance records submitted by my father bore clear signs of forgery. That evening, I returned to Windermere House one last time to collect the remainder of my personal archives. The grand hall was dead silent. The towering Christmas tree was still brilliantly lit, casting a warm glow over the velvet furniture, but the caterers were gone, the press conference was canceled, and the house felt like a massive, empty tomb. Malcolm stood alone in the center of the room. He looked at me. His shoulders slumped. The arrogant patriarch entirely broken. He looked at me as if he were truly seeing me for the very first time in his life. He asked, his voice hollow and weak, if I was finally satisfied. No, I replied, my tone devoid of any anger or pity. Being treated like a human being from the very beginning would have been enough. I turned and walked out of the estate into the freezing winter night. It was a stark contrast to my departure on Christmas Eve. This time, I was not stepping out into the cold as an unwanted outcast banished from the warm parlor. I was walking away as the sole authority, the person finally locking the doors on a toxic, exhausted theater production after the final curtain had fallen. Several months later, the dust had fully settled. I legally restructured the entire Newport property, transforming it into a genuine, highly regulated conservation and residency trust, properly honoring the name and true intentions of Estelle Ravenswood. My life moved forward. But sitting at my desk in my new, sunlit office in Boston, I keep one specific item displayed on the corner of my blotter. It is a pristine, blank Christmas card, entirely devoid of a name or a greeting. I keep it there as a permanent, quiet reminder that there are certain kinds of families who will only ever understand your true value the exact moment you stop holding up the roof for them. If this story stayed with you, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to Helena Revenge Stories and like the video.